Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week in Illinois in Focus, we'll discuss Wednesday's historic verdict in the corruption trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, who was convicted Wednesday on 10 counts of corruption-related charges. What's next for Madigan? Will the jury's verdict lead to ethics reforms at the state capitol? All that and more when we come back with Illinois in Focus.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. Longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan is now convicted felon Michael Madigan after a jury convicted him on 10 of 23 corruption-related counts against him. Joining me to discuss this is our man in the courtroom, reporter Jim Talamonte. Jim, you were there when the verdicts were read. What was going through your head when the first guilty verdict was announced?
Yeah, it was a tense scene. I was looking at Mike Madigan, and he, as usual, had a serious look on his face, very stoic. The judge, John Robert Blake, had warned, no outbursts in the courtroom. He wouldn't tolerate any of that. Not that you were going to get that, I think, with this crowd and in particular with these defendants. But the first count was a deadlock, and we knew going in there were going to be deadlocks on 12 out of the 29 counts total between the two defendants, but then count two, guilty. And you just, right there, you knew, wow, here we are. This man who ran Illinois politics he was speaker for 36 years. He was in the state house for 50, ran the Democratic Party of Illinois for 23, and was a major power broker, not just in state government, but city, Cook County. He appeared in national interviews. Mike Madigan is a guilty after all those years of seeming untouchable. And so there was tension in the courtroom, but I don't think there was shock. But at the same time, you really didn't know which way this was going to go. You just never do with a jury.
Right. Well, so there were 23 counts against Madigan. His co-defendant, Michael McClain, they were co-charged, or they were each charged with six of the same specific charges. The jury deadlocked on all six of those. So only Madigan was convicted, and it was on 10 charges. We can't go into every detail of each of those charges, but give our listeners some idea of what some of those charges were that he was convicted on.
Several involved ComEd, I should say. The AT&T was a deadlock count involving McClain. ComEd counts related to Madigan, even though McClain was a ComEd lobbyist, a contract lobbyist for ComEd. But McClain, remember, had previously been convicted in the ComEd 4 trial on some of those related issues and crimes. And so he wasn't charged here. This was Madigan. And so Madigan was found guilty. There was bribery, there was wire fraud, unlawful use of a facility, or use of a facility for unlawful acts, and there I think I said wire fraud, and there was a conspiracy charge. But again, the main charges where he was found guilty were related to ComEd and related to a state board position, which was, as defense attorney, Madigan's defense attorney, Dan Collins, said this was a ruse set up by the government, in essence, to find Madigan engaged in this activity to exchange, in essence, the state board position for then Chicago Alderman Daniel Solis, who was cooperating with the government, in exchange for real estate tax business for Madigan's private law firm, where he made major money from developers. And many of those developers were brought to him by, Solis and others so that he would gain tax business as the Illinois Speaker of the House.
Now, the ComEd charges that he was convicted on, were they directly related to him getting, his friends and allies jobs with ComEd?
Yes, one of the counts involved Mike Zaleski, who was a Chicago alderman, not the state rep. This is the father, Mike Zaleski, who had been an alderman, both Madigan allies, and so he was one who was receiving these payments. There was a precinct captain, Ray Nice. So some of Madigan's allies would get these payments from a contractor. There were several contractors, and so these were subcontractors, Madigan allies, who got these jobs, which they had to do either very little work or no work in exchange for these payments from ComEd. And so ComEd was doing this to curry favor with Madigan and get legislation passed. There were several pieces of legislation, you may remember, energy bills that Pat Quinn as governor vetoed, and Madigan and company passed those over Quinn's vetoes in 2011 and 2013. There was later the FEJA, Future Energy Jobs Act, in 2016. All of these were extremely beneficial financially to ComEd. So paying these, the sum that the prosecutors allege these Madigan allies were paid was, I think, $1.3 million, but the legislation benefit ComEd by tens of millions or more. And ComEd did, in a previous deferred prosecution agreement, pay tens of millions in fees for that deal.
And as we talked about, that the deferred prosecution agreement with ComEd and with AT&T, and the ComEd 4 previous trial that McClain was convicted, and those were not allowed to be mentioned.
Right. Those were not mentioned. The jurors did not know that Mike McClain had been convicted in the ComEd 4 trial. And, I was thinking about, boy, how is it that McClain, who you hear on a lot more of these tapes than you heard Madigan, and who was wiretapped and who was engaged in a lot of these back and forth conversations with Danny Solis, with Nancy Kimmy, who was a lobbyist who was trying to push the Chinatown parcel onto legislation. When that legislation got attached to a bill, State Rep Avery Bourne couldn't move her land transfer legislation, but when this parcel was added to it, all of a sudden it moved, or was going to move. It ended up not going through. So you hear McClain on all these tapes and all these recordings and emails, and yet McClain, not found guilty on any of these counts. And I wonder if, Madigan, when he took the stand, was very dismissive of McClain. They had been very close, and he said until recently, and Madigan went out of his way to be really dismissive of McClain. Did you consult Mike McClain on this? Well, I did, as others. He was very dismissive of McClain, and I wonder if that hurt him with jurors.
And sentencing has not been scheduled yet. But Madigan does face prison time.
Yes. I mean, if you add up all of these counts, 10 counts, some of them with 5 years, some of them with 10, if the prosecutors go for the maximum, which I don't expect they would, but if they did, maybe they will. But if they go for the maximum on all these counts, he could be looking at decades. Most observers, court analysts don't expect that he'll get that much, but he could. It could get decades. Also, there's a forfeiture, which hearing set for May 5th, where he could be forfeiting assets.
And that's a bench trial, right? No jury in that one. And do you know what the potential liability is for him in that case?
I believe that they may confirm this at that hearing, but the word was that it was over $1 million in assets that they would be seeking from Madigan and McClain had he been convicted. He wasn't. So I'm not sure if that number is Madigan only, or if that was a number that would have applied to both, and it may have depended on the counts. But that's a bench trial that the judge had indicated he wanted to do that right after this verdict, like the next business day, but that didn't happen. The attorneys conferred, and the prosecutor said, well, we can do this after the defense teams, file their post-trial motions. They agreed, and then this morning word comes that it's not till May 5th, so it's going to be a while. Sentencing likely is going to be, beyond that. There's no date set for that.
Madigan himself, of course, is 82, Speaker of the House for 38 years, longest-serving state House Speaker in the country's history. He was a legislator, elected state representative for longer than that before he became Speaker, but he's now 82, and he's been held accountable for those charges. Sentencing should be sooner than later, I would think.
Having said that, we're still waiting for McClain to be sentenced with the ComEd 4. That was not 2024. That was 2023 when that verdict came down. We're still waiting. Since then, Anne Pramaggiore, the former ComEd CEO, we heard on many of these recordings, she was convicted with McClain and 2 others. She's gone on a trip to Italy. If this happened to you or me, I don't think we'd have the delay or the trip to Italy. It's a different life if you're an Illinois politician, and we wonder why they don't change ethics rules in the state house, right?
We'll get into that here in a bit and a bit next, but it is amazing how the criminal justice system and just how long some of these things can take. I mean, Madigan himself when the investigation became public, resigned. Like, what was it? Was it 2020 or 2021 that he resigned his position in the State House? It's now 2025, and we're still, like, we had the trial, we've got the conviction, but we're still waiting for the sentencing to be carried out. Jim, so after yesterday's conviction, plenty of reaction around the state from Republican lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers, including in leadership. Republicans have been calling for ethics reforms, it seems like forever, in Springfield. The rules, the House rules that Madigan put in place during his 38 years as Speaker, that many say are too restrictive, consolidate too much power within the speakership, they're still pretty much the same as they were when Madigan is in there. One of the calls is for the House to change its rules to allow, for example, anything any piece of legislation that the Speaker doesn't like, he doesn't have to move it forward. Plenty of Republican pieces of legislation just get blocked or dead. They're dead on arrival from being filed. What do you think is going to happen after this historic conviction? Will there be actual ethics reform?
Well, Republicans are pushing for it. They not only, they did obviously in post-verdict statements yesterday and this morning, but I talked to several during the trial. They were pushing for it then. Even some Democrats, former Governor Quinn, has said, we need an ethics initiative in Illinois as states around us like Missouri and Ohio have, where citizens can put ethics measures on the ballot for consideration. We can't do that here. So there's definitely, if you put it to a public referendum, of course, there'd be popular support. But, as some of these Republican lawmakers have pointed out, many of the Democrats still in the State House are there either because of Mike Madigan, or if they weren't financially supported by him, they certainly were. They were on, they weren't opposing him. There was a move to oppose him in around 2018, 2019 with the Me Too movement, when some of Madigan's associates had sexual harassment allegations. But before that, there was virtually no opposition from Democrats, and there was even some complacency and complicitness among some Republicans. Others, no. Others were vehemently against the Speaker. But, it's in the Democrats' hands. The supermajority is still there, thanks in part to the maps that have been drawn during the Madigan era, and just the funding and the powerful machine. One of the I think it was a state rep, one person pointed out, well, the two people who were in charge of investigating the Madigan case when the still Health Ethics Committee was formed to look into that. One was rewarded by being his replacement as Speaker, Chris Welch. Right. The other was rewarded by replacing him as chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois, which is the other powerful position. That Madigan ran the state Democratic Party for 23 years. So how many of these Democrats who benefited from his campaign committee, which is still there, he dipped into it for his legal defense, but I believe there's still money in it. So how many of these, Susanna Mendoza, longtime ally of Madigan, I didn't see a statement. We've seen all kinds of anti-Trump statements from all of these people in and around J.B. Pritzker, but boy, we haven't seen a lot. We haven't seen any of the Democrats say, now is the time for more ethics. They'll say it's a new day and now is a different time and we're going to move forward. But let's see if there's anything concrete, and let's see if, I haven't seen any bills filed yet. So I'm on the Democrat side.
Right. Just a couple of other ethical reforms that Republicans have been calling for, as we said, years. There's a legislative inspector general who's charged with investigating complaints against lawmakers, staffs or whatever. That position has largely been toothless. I remember just a few years ago, going back to when the Me Too movement, the harassment of women, the sexual harassment of women came to the forefront around the country, also in Illinois. We learned back then that there was no person in the legislative inspector general position, and something like 20 complaints were filed, collecting dust on just on a shelf somewhere. Well, they finally got around to hiring a legislative inspector general. That person got in there and realized there was nothing they could do. They didn't have any subpoena power. They couldn't launch an investigation into somebody unless they got the approval of the Legislative Ethics Committee, which is made up of, guess what? Sitting legislators. So that's another reform that Republicans have called for, and also this revolving door thing where legislators resign. Legislators will resign, and the next day they'll start working for a lobbying group, lobbying that very same legislature. Republicans have called for some period of time, years, before a legislature ends his or her position in the state legislature and takes a lobbying position. Those are all reforms that Republicans have been calling for years. We'll see if anything happens this legislative session. Just to wrap up this segment, on Madigan, you've been in the courthouse just about every day, every weekday since October. A couple of breaks, break during the Christmas and New Year's holidays, etc. What was the experience like? It had to have been exhausting. I'm sure it was exhausting. He talked about that, but just overall, what was the experience like?
There were a lot of long days. There were days of minutia, and there were days when it really dragged. A jury selection, I remember that the judge had said that the jury selection fascinated him, and he was really he thought it was one of the most important parts of the trial. But boy, there were times when a prospective juror would be up there. You'd know about 5 minutes in they weren't going to be, one side or the other was going to disapprove, and yet the questioning would continue. And sometimes they were up there for 20, 25, maybe even 30 minutes. And boy, I think it could have been a little shorter then. Overall, I thought the judge was in control of the courtroom. Really, I'm not smart enough legally to know whether all of his objections, sustaining or accepting, were right on. But boy, the way he ran the courtroom, the way he gave instructions. His father wrote some of these very corruption statutes that were under consideration in this case. The RICO laws, if you will. And so it was fascinating. I thought there were times when they probably could have moved it along a little bit more, but he told the attorneys, I'm not going to rush it. But the sacrifice of the jurors was remarkable because, however much of a grind it may have been for those of us covering it and for the legal teams involved and for the judge and his staff, wow, for the jurors, this was a major sacrifice to be away from their jobs, away from their families. And they were, the judge commented several times on how diligent they were. We didn't have any dropout. We didn't have any miss because they were sick or just didn't show up. Once in a while, someone would be on a late train and there's a good chance one of the lawyers was going to be in the same boat. So, it was remarkable, quite a learning experience. And then there were also some amazing, there were dramatic, I don't know if I'd say like movie scenes, but, in Amar Bachu's, rebuttal, the final end of the closing arguments where the prosecutor do the rebuttal, and he's talking about Madigan and McClain being not playing checkers but playing chess, and these were grand masters of corruption. And then he launched into invoking Eddie Acevedo, the state rep, who was angry that AT&T wasn't going to give him more money to do nothing. F-A-T, and he launched. He said, I'm going to say it. He told her, I'm going to say it. And he launched into it. And it was like a flurry of haymakers from a boxer in a prize fight. It was really powerful and remarkable.
Hey, I'm sorry, Jim, another question. I'm just fascinated by this whole thing. I don't know that if we've heard officially or not. I would expect Madigan through his attorneys to appeal the verdict. But as you mentioned, it was almost a full 2 weeks of deliberations. 12 jurors, 12 different people, independent people, came to the same decision on 17 of these charges, 10 guilty verdicts, 7 not guilty verdicts. And then, in open court, they admitted they couldn't come to an agreement on these remaining 6 charges. The fact that they deliberated for almost 2 full weeks, came to different decisions on each count, or came to different conclusions on each count, some unanimously, some they couldn't agree on. That tells me that this jury did its job. Right? They went through each count, carefully considered each and every count and the evidence that was presented for each and every count, and came up with what they came up with.
And they had over 100 pages of instructions, and these weren't, this wasn't tic-tac-toe. This was complicated legal stuff by a judge whose father wrote these laws, and he's writing instructions on these laws. So they were detailed, and there was a question that came up last Friday, and it was the judges. There was a judge who sat in for Blakey on Friday to read this note, and he consulted Blakey, and it was a note specific to these instructions about salary versus things of value, and was a bona fide salary a thing of value and related to the law. And in the discussion with between the attorneys and the judge, well, and then this was Judge Edmund Chang, and he said, well, this is an area where Illinois law isn't clear on this. And so what an intelligent question by this jury. This wasn't asking, what's a conspiracy? This was really a question that told you they were really reading these instructions carefully and really taking it seriously. And so the number of times Blakey said, even earlier in the trial, talked about how diligent they were and how conscientious they were. And so it was, whether you agree with how they came out on the counts or not, you can't say they were just said, okay, let's get it over with and let's throw the book at him, or we like him because he grew up in an Irish Catholic family, so let's let him. This was obviously they were very diligent is a good word to say, how they went through this and how they asked, the detailed question told you they weren't just sugarcoating here, weren't skimming the surface. They were really getting into the nitty gritty of this stuff. And so, it had to be a great learning experience for them, but boy, a great sacrifice of time.
Well, and you as well, Jim. Thanks to a great job covering the trial for the centersquare.com. I do want to squeeze in one more story. Imagine this. We're going from one Illinois corruption story to another Illinois corruption story. This week, President Donald Trump pardoned former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. If you remember, during the Trump's first term, more than 4 years ago, he commuted the sentence. Blagojevich was sitting in a federal prison, and back then, Trump commuted his prison sentence. This week, Trump granted him a full pardon, meaning he no longer has a corruption conviction on his record. Is it ironic that the same week that Madigan was convicted?
The first people I thought of were these prosecutors, because you talk about the sacrifice of the jury. Well, these prosecutors, they're well paid, but they're not paid like the high-priced defense attorneys that you see on billboards, and the amount of work they put in. And in talking with a prosecutor in a different division who works with some of these lead prosecutors in the case, he said, they would be there late at night. One of them canceled a trip she had planned with her husband for their anniversary. The amount of work and the amount of volume of it, and extending beyond the prosecutors to the FBI agents, and to think of all the people who did that for not one, but two Blagojevich trials, where there were two. The first one was a mistrial on most counts. And so to think of all that work and to then have it essentially wiped away, the conviction that they worked so hard for had to be disappointing. And so, in following this case, I gained appreciation for the judge, but also for all the attorneys. And then the judge also complimented all the attorneys in the case for all sides for their professionalism. He told the defendants that you were well represented, regardless of how this verdict is. I don't know what it's going to be. You were well represented. And then he said the government too, your professionalism, they met and conferred on things to avoid taking more time in court arguing, so the jury didn't have to sit through a lot of that stuff. But boy, the work of these prosecutors, if for anyone who hates to see public corruption or wants to see that, wants to see real cleaner government, the work that they put into this and shining light on all this stuff that was happening under Madigan's rule, is heroic too strong a word? I don't know. They really put in a lot of work.
But Jim, again, a great job covering it, informing our readers on a day-to-day basis what was going on there, and then, of course, the verdict. Jim, also thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.